Designing course goals and learning outcomes. By the end of this video, you will be able to identify the essential components of course goals and learning outcomes, and design course goals and learning outcomes for an online course. It can be fun to get in your car and start driving with no goal. However, it's less fun to be a student in a course where there is no goal. It's important when planning a course to map out where you want your students to go. Creating learning goals for an online course will be similar to doing so in a face-to-face course. When mapping out a route, you start by thinking about your end goal. By the end of your course, what do you hope students will be able to do? Notice that I asked what you hope your students will be able to do, not what you hope your students will be able to know. For how can one really know what another knows? In that vein, you want to write your course goals so that they are broad and reflect what you want your students to be able to do by the end of your course, but also so that they are measurable and observable. For example, in teaching an elementary mathematics methods course, one of my major course goals might be students will be able to design lesson plans that incorporate research-based teaching practices specific to mathematics education. Let's be sure that this is an appropriate course goal. It's broad. It highlights one thing that I hope students will be able to do after an entire semester. It's measurable, meaning I can design an assessment to see if this outcome has been met. And it's observable. It describes an action or a behavior and not a knowledge. There's no magic number of course goals, but there should not be too many, or you might not have written them broad enough. Now that I have an idea of course goals, I can move on to writing my learning outcomes. What's the difference between the two? Course goals are broad and are what they sound like, goals for the course. Learning outcomes are the rungs of the ladder, so to speak, that help you get there. Learning outcomes are the goals for a lesson or a series of lessons. Remember that course goals are broad, measurable, and observable. Learning outcomes should also be measurable and observable. However, they should be specific. For example, my broad goal of teaching students to design effective lesson plans depends on a lot of smaller goals. For example, identifying the essential components of a lesson plan and deconstructing mathematical concepts like adding fractions in a way students might not have previously. Notice that my learning objectives also use action verbs like my course goals do. A quick Google search of Bloom's taxonomy verbs can help you get started on developing a list of these verbs. Speaking of, let's look at Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Bloom's taxonomy identifies different levels of thinking from lower order to higher order. After you've written your course goals and learning outcomes, ask yourself, are all of my learning outcomes focused on remembering? If yes, you may want to reconsider and include some goals associated with some higher levels of learning and thinking. Remember that these levels are hierarchical, so if you're requiring students to analyze, it also assumes that they are remembering, understanding, and applying. To summarize, some tips for designing your learning outcomes and course goals are to make them student-centered, written using an action verb, specific or broad depending on whether you're writing your lesson objectives or your course goals, measurable, observable, and aligned to instruction and assessment, which will be the focus of another module. You can think of the course goals as the major overarching ideas, maybe organized by units or projects of your course. Then we zoom in to each larger course goal and consider the more detailed learning objectives for each goal. Check out the checklist for creating learning goals found in your module reading.